Good afternoon, everyone. It is now 12:04 instead of 12 o'clock, and we're back in, and this is how the world is with Microsoft Teams and COVID-19. Let's get started. My name is Colonel Deydre Teyhen, and I have the pleasure of being the commander of the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, and I'm joined today with three colleagues that we will discuss the role of resilience and leadership. I am excited to be here and to see so many people signed in with us today and with others joining in as I speak. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping measures. Today's discussion is live and is being recorded. You will have access to the recorded link within a few days, and it will be posted on the rare social media platforms. If you're in the audience, you can actually submit questions in the Q&A either for yourself or as anonymous. So you can actually select anonymous and if you're not wanting your name to be known with that question. We have two moderators here who are going to help keep us on track, and I'll keep an eye on the question and answer portion. And we'll do our best to answer as many questions as time allows when we open things up. But without further ado, let's dive in. So today we will talk about how leaders can mitigate team stress. Stress and uncertainty are words we hear often these days with the ongoing pandemic of the coronavirus layered in with the continued social injustice work that is going around our country, and really trying to make our world a more equitable and safe place for all. It has been many months of us being really alone together, right? We have pivoted to using platforms such as this to not only continue our work, but to connect with family and friends, and we have adapted to find a connection, yet stress can still remain. In particular, team stress is something we can relate to, whether it's in a unit, with coworkers, sports, volunteering. We can see team dynamics in many places. When stakes like health and safety get higher, stress can be a result. Stress and proper tools to manage it are also natural to military life. As the Department of Defense shifts its focus to multi-domain operations, where we anticipate smaller teams will operate with greater autonomy, potentially without air support, communications, or other resources, and emotionally and physically strong teams become even more important. We know that leaders play a strong role in setting an organization culture, and that helps manage team stress in a healthy way and ultimately strengthens teams. Our goal today is to talk about stress mitigation, the importance of team culture, and some tips today that describe how to do that in your daily life. I'm privileged to have three experts online with me to talk about this. First, we have Lieutenant Colonel Col Sam Preston. He's the Chief of Army Medicine's Behavioral Health Service Line at the Army Surgeon General's, and he's also the Army Surgeon General's Psychiatry Consultant and a physician board certified in family medicine and psychiatry. Welcome, Colonel Preston. Second, we have Dr. Mandy ONeill, the Associate Professor of Management and Senior Scientist at the Center of the Advancement of Well-Being, both at George Mason University. Her research focuses on management, leadership, and organization culture. And third, I'm joined today by Dr. Amy Adler, the Senior Scientist here at RARE's Center for Military Psychiatry and Neuroscience. She's worked with units around the world to identify behavioral health concerns in the military and provide relevant, usable solutions to overcome them. Thank you all for joining us today. It is great to be able to get together to talk about stress and ways we can mitigate stress among our team in a format like this. What I love about this group is that we have today is that we have unique paths to learning about team cultures. As we dive in, I'd like to pass the first question to Colonel Preston. Can you briefly summarize and define stress and how we will be referring to it today?
Ma'am, thank you, first of all, for that wonderful introduction. It was my pleasure also, I have to say, it's an honor being with the folks that are on this call, and it's been an honor to serve. I actually got to see resilient leadership in action when I was the Chief of Behavioral Health at Schofield Barracks, and one of my commanders named Colonel Teyhen showed us how it was done there. So it's an honor and a privilege to be here. But I really like the vocabulary you use, because words are important, and I'll get back to it, but you used the word team, at least I counted 3 times. And we've heard it, those of us that wear the uniform or have been around a minute, we've heard that the Army is an outside sport and we need to know how to play it. And it's an organized team sport. And so when we talk about stress, sports teams go through stress, and we're going to define it in a very similar way. It's defined as a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adversity or very demanding circumstances. So that's the general Webster's dictionary, but it's also a natural state of being. It can lead to growth, personal evolution. I heard Colonel Teyhen mention adaptation in her introduction, evolution. But it can also, if not kept in check or if it's not harnessed in the right way, it can lead to undesired consequences like depression, insomnia, and difficulties. So when we talk about stress in the context of the Army and why it's important, I'm going to go back to that team concept. And I like to use a metaphor. So I happen to like basketball teams. And so as we're talking about stress, I want you to imagine good stress management. And if you've ever watched the NCAA tournament and you've seen it's the last seconds of the game and there's a timeout and you see the coach in very, very high stress levels, you can feel it, the energy in the audience, you can see it in the team. You see that coach, pick your favorite one, calm and collective, harnessing that energy of that team, that stress, and making it so that they can use that energy to win the game. And so when we talk about stress, we also have to understand that it's a natural part of the game of life. And how we harness that stress is extremely important. I think something that our colleagues are going to talk about. So that's how we're going to be talking about stress today, ma'am.
Well, Colonel Preston, I think that's really amazing. When you look at the highest professional athletes, not all pro athletes, but the Serena Williams of sports, what they found is they can bring their heart rate down quickly in between hitting the ball back so that they can actually have that observational capability and bandwidth to now know where to respond to the next volley coming over the court for Serena Williams. And ability to do that better really distinguishes not just pro athletes, but the best of the pro athletes. And so, Dr. ONeill, I'm curious from your perspective, when you look at this from your academic settings.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself in terms of the difference between what's called good stress and bad stress. So, academics like to find a jargony word for every single concept. So we usually call it eustress versus distress. And so kind of what we're getting at here is the idea that not all stress is bad. There is good stress, so to speak, eustress, which can be really motivational. And in fact, as a leadership strategy, it's something that I'm sure many leaders have experience with, which is you want to get a little fire in the belly. That's a good thing. But when it gets to be too much stress, or when it gets to be the so-called bad stress or distress, that's where we need to worry about it, especially in teams, because this kind of stress or the anxiety that sometimes comes with it is highly contagious.
Thank you so much. So Dr. Adler, as I look back, you've done so much work in this area over the last 30 years. The one thing I think about is one of your publications that if you look at the ramifications of stress and where it doesn't work well in teams is when soldiers view their leaders as poor, their rate of psychological distress goes up, stress, anxiety, depression goes up. And we've seen that in some of your publications as high as like 22% of people, when they think their officer and NCO leadership is poor, that they really have a psychological response to that. And when they actually think that their officer and NCO leadership is good, that number goes down to less than 6%. What have you seen on stress management from your perspective, not only from the individual, but from the team?
One of the most important things is learning how to unmute. So that skill is now something I'm going to keep practicing, and we'll see how that works. Clearly, I need leadership to help me be better at unmuting, just like units that are going through high levels of stress need periods of time where their leaders step in and really kind of offer a difference. And there are different ways in which leaders can be impactful. So the research has shown that good leadership is associated with all kinds of better outcomes for soldiers. So this is true in general, but it's also particularly true under conditions of high levels of stress. So for example, there have been studies shown with soldiers that are deployed, and when under high stress conditions related to combat, those who report having really good leaders are much less likely to report symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. So, you know, there's a clear connection there, but that kind of leadership is generally, you can think of it as sort of general leadership. It's generally being a good leader who can set the tone and inspire people. And it's really hard to kind of nail that down and to capture that and then to train that. So one of the things that we did early on is we started to think about what are the ways in which we can describe leadership behaviors that are really doable, concrete, specific leader behaviors, and do those leader behaviors make a difference above and beyond having somebody generally be a good leader. And so some of the studies that we've run have been really interesting because they've shown that even controlling for generally being a good leader, if you have a leader who's attuned to behavioral health in a unit or operational stress, then that unit benefits in terms of mental health outcomes, in terms of their willingness to seek care, in terms of their sense that their unit is capable of rebounding well. So it's this extra little edge that units can get when their leaders engage in these specific behaviors. And so that's been a nice insight for us because it's led us to realize we can now develop training specifically for leaders that can help boost unit outcomes.
Wonderful. Before we go on to this, the leadership checklist that's going to talk about next, is there any alibis from the anyone that want to provide any additional introductory remarks? All right, so we're ready to move on then. So Dr. Adler, thank you for sharing this and linking your years of research and leading these kinds of studies have shown about performance and readiness. Can you walk us through the leadership checklist you and your team developed for managing stress during COVID-19?
Yes, certainly. So I wanted to describe how we came about this checklist to start with. So right at the beginning of the pandemic, back in March, we were all obviously trying to adjust quickly and figure out kind of what this new challenge was going to look like and what the parameters were going to be like and how bad it was going to get. Obviously, none of us knew at the time, but what we were interested in is, you know, I was starting to think, how could we be relevant? And as in terms of the research that we do and the training that we develop and the assessments that we do. And one of the leaders within our own organization, within RARE, reached out to me and said, hey, you know, this is uncharted territory for my team. And we're running, you know, 24/7 operations trying to solve issues related to COVID. What do you have for me that can help me be a better leader? And it was like a light bulb went off for me. And I thought, you know, I actually have things that could potentially help. So with her in mind, I started to develop this checklist with the team. And it really was an opportunity to kind of think specifically about her and then realize quickly, actually, this could apply to lots of leaders across the Army, not just specifically to her. So we created something that's relatively simple because I kept thinking right now is not a time to develop some complex, in-depth, highly cognitively demanding training because we're all just trying to get by and we're really all taxed. You know what happens with stress when people are under chronic stress like we've all been under, it actually impacts our ability to process information quickly, to make good decisions. It impacts our ability to think. And so I didn't want to add to that burden. I wanted to really kind of break it down into something sort of simple and something that has two parts to it. One is, as a leader, what are you doing to help others? But the other is, what are you doing for yourself? So you'll see in the checklist, there are kind of these two parts. One is, what do you need to check in for in terms of the behaviors you're engaging in, and then how do you need to watch out for your own health and your own well-being? So there are different categories that we have in the checklist, and I'm happy to walk us through those. It's everything from share information is just sort of a basic idea, and that's always good. But I think in moments of high stress, like we've all been under, even kind of these essential and basic ideas are important to remind people of. So share information, and when you don't have information, Say that you don't have information rather than wait around until that information gets finalized. Let people know you don't know the answer yet. And that's okay, because then at least it quells rumors, which are always an issue. And don't forget about the importance of connection. Now, we've done lots of research, and other groups have done too, showing the connection or the importance of personal connection in addressing loneliness and social isolation. Social isolation puts people at risk for all kinds of issues, psychologically and physiologically. So it's important to maintain that personal connection, whether it's running meetings through a regular routine time period, or giving people that extra space to connect on the phone or via text, or maybe socially distanced in an appropriate way. And it's remembering that you have to connect to the entire team and that people don't get left out. And then one of our self-check questions is, what about yourself? Are you remembering to stay connected with people that are important to you? So it's not just a matter of what you do as a leader, but you also check in with yourself. And then this is another important topic, and that is, it's really important to recognize limits. The fact is, this is really stressful. This is hard stuff, and it may be harder for some people than for others. Everybody responds to stress in a different way. So it might be helpful to just remember, what's really important, what are you trying to communicate, and then over communicate it. People are likely to make mistakes. They're likely to kind of forget things. And so build in redundant systems to try to back people up during these really difficult periods of time. So kind of build in that extra layer, because you can predict that under these high levels of stress that we've all been going through since March, that having these extra systems can help everybody. So one concrete example, rather than searching out for people to figure out how to take some mandatory training, you put the link in directly and you offer it a couple of times into some mass email that might go out, because that helps everybody. It's hard, it's harder to process all the little details and keep track of everything. Then, of course, there's physical resilience. And now this one's going to sound familiar, I think, to everybody in the military, because we have, especially in the Army, we have the performance triad, which is all about, sleep, getting adequate sleep, eating well, and staying active. So all of those remain really, really important. And that's certainly something that needs to be managed both for the individual leader and then for the individual leader to encourage that in their team. And then there's psychological resilience. There are lots of different ways that people find the ability to kind of garner their psychological resources. So there's no one size fits all here, but there are things like mindfulness. There's things like making sure you don't have too much consumption of the news. You kind of have to balance that right, so you avoid kind of being frozen by too much negativity. And also to use we offered specific, very simple descriptions of how to help unit members who might have anxiety spikes. So for example, for medical personnel who are donning PPE right in the beginning, when that was unusual and just the sheer expanse in the civilian community was really stressing people, using these kinds of grounding techniques of just orienting yourself at that moment and kind of focusing your attention can help people cope with high levels of anxiety. So other things included normalizing stress, being right out there saying, yes, I acknowledge this. This is a big thing. As a leader, to acknowledge it is really helpful, because it gives people permission to be understood and to feel understood. And then to seize the moment. Now, this kind of flips it a little bit, but this is a really amazing opportunity as leaders to just try to do the best you can under really difficult circumstances. So it's really kind of a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful challenge to both you as a leader, and then also to your team, and how you can get the best out of your team and help them see that what they do matters and that what they do is making a difference, even if they're not directly solving the coronavirus. Whatever they're doing is part of a solution. It's part of moving people forward. And it's an important thing, and reminding people of that is a way to help seize that moment. And then finally, it's controlling the controllables. That's a little catchphrase we use, because there's only so much you can control in life. If you try to control the stuff you can't control, you're going to expend a lot of energy in a way that's not helpful. So you got to kind of figure out which piece of this challenge is something that you have direct control over as a leader, and which piece do you have to practice acceptance. And acceptance is a skill. It's the ability to be with and not react to whatever the challenge is that you can't control. And so that's something to practice. It's something to lead by example. and it's something to encourage. So those are kind of the highlights that we hit in the document.
Thank you, Dr. Adler. I appreciate that. You know, as this pandemic started, I would tell folks this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And then at some point I went from a marathon to an Ironman triathlon. And now it's actually multiple Ironman triathlons that we're all having to endure, and taking the long view on this and really understanding those is really important, because it's obviously no longer a short-term stressor. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. ONeill for her comments on what leaders can think through this checklist.
So thank you so much, Dr. Adler. That was just a beautiful description of what I would say is, 30 years of research packed into this incredibly helpful and actionable checklist. So, kudos from the academic side in terms of, saving, everybody from 30 years of journals to really boil it down to the most important nuggets that are actionable and that everybody can do. Another thing that leaders can do, that's something that's talked about a little bit but highly misunderstood, is actually shaping the team culture. So we hear a lot about culture, and culture has all sorts of levels to it. So we've got national culture, we've got, Army culture, we've got, certain command culture, we've got culture at the different hierarchical levels. But one of the things that's so important, that's very actionable, is controlling and managing the team culture. So what do I mean by culture? Culture has a lot of different parts to it, some of which the checklist actually referred to sort of, indirectly. So, the deepest part of culture, the core, is what is taken for granted. So this is the least actionable in a way. It's the stuff that's just so implicit, it's why we do what we do, but we don't even know. And in fact, usually we don't find out until something's violated. And so, usually the importance of culture comes up when suddenly there's a violation of some, hugely important assumption. Like, for example, the importance of teamwork. I love the sports metaphor, because actually teamwork is all over sports metaphors, and you wouldn't want to have one member of the team who's taking all the credit when, like, we all know it's a team effort. I mean, that's one of the sort of, principal violated assumptions that we don't even realize we necessarily had until it's broken. So we want to shape those assumptions, and we particularly want to shape those assumptions around how we can take care of ourselves, how we can take care of others, and how leaders can influence that. So what can leaders do to affect the assumptions? They can actually impact the other layers of culture. So there are some aspects of culture that are highly visible. So this would be like, when I go into organizations, one of the first things I look for are the comics around people's personal space. So, therein lies the humor. Like, what is funny? What is taboo? How do we cope with really frustrating situations in our lives? This is a very visible manifestation of culture. Another is the norms and rituals. So what do we do? What are sort of like, the way we do things around here? How do we socialize newcomers to be part of us? Leaders have a lot of control over those norms and rituals. Do we, for example, how do we eat our lunches? This sounds like a really simple thing, but I actually have some evidence, and there's other evidence as well. My research comes from work on firefighters who actually really emulate military culture in a lot of ways. And they would say the, first and most important thing is breaking bread together. So do we sit down? Do we have a meal together? And one of the things that's important for is not just, nutrition, which is important and sometimes one of the first to go when we're under a lot of stress, but it's more important in terms of creating the cohesion among people. So it's getting to know each other. It's getting to know what's going on in each other's lives. It's awfully hard for leaders to take care of each other if they don't have any idea what's going on in their team's lives. And it's hard for team members to take care of each other. So one of the things that comes out when you break bread is you actually share what's going on in people's lives. So there are kind of two aspects I'm getting at here, which are a little bit different in terms of culture. We're talking specifically about the emotional culture. And this is something that I would say is probably the least talked about, in part because we just don't always have a vocabulary. We would say, something stress, when actually, what it really is anxiety. So it's this looming fear of the unknown about what's going on. So in some of my own research, I've found that anxiety can be crippling when it's unmanaged. And the other thing about it is it's highly contagious. So just being around someone can make you feel anxious as well. So it's not even, you weren't anxious until all of a sudden you're hanging around someone else and then you catch their anxiety. So one of the ways we found, again, very actionable, that can help mitigate this anxiety is developing a culture around caring and compassion. So some people call it camaraderie, some people call it brotherly love. There are lots of names for it, but it's around taking care of each other. And one of the ways to do so is getting to know each other, getting to know each other's lives, checking in with each other, little acts of kindness. So if you know somebody's going through a hard time, what burden can you take off them? And by the way, this includes taking care of the people who are taking care of you. So sometimes supervisors need taking care of too. So it can be something as simple as, bringing Colonel Teyhen a cup of tea if she's going through a stressful time, bringing Colonel Preston some Red Bull if he's going through a stressful time. Knowing that that is their drink of choice. In my case, it's coffee. I'm a little past the noon hour here, but it's kind of knowing each other well and knowing how to take care of them, which creates this culture, and it's reciprocal. So these little acts of kindness, they catch on, they spread. And last thing I'll say there is not to forget, coming back to the humor, don't forget the humor. There are some things we just can't control that are incredibly stressful. So some people would, refer to that sort of morbid sense of humor and, don't want to talk about it. I would actually say, let's embrace that, because humor is a fantastic way of coping with things that we just can't control. So kind of summarizing all of that, I would say, leaders, it's important to focus on the emotional culture of the team, and the checklist is an excellent way to sort of create those rituals, create those norms, normalize those things within the team culture.
Thank you so much. That was very enlightening. As we move to Colonel Sam Preston, what you might not know is Colonel Preston's been on the ground floor for many years in creating the embedded behavioral health. So he's seen the military team cultures on many installations as they figured out how to best support these military teams out there and build resilience. So Colonel Preston, as you see this resilience checklist, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I'm so impressed by the language that we're using as a panel, and thinking about the checklist. I hear the word team coming up regularly, but also the word unit. And I'm going to get back to why the word unit is very, very important. But more than 30% of soldiers report feeling socially isolated from their teams, and so places them at risk for increased behavioral health concerns. Isolation can lead to anxiety if you're not trusting your team, depression. Perhaps we can all remember the angst of being teenagers and how isolating that was and how we felt maybe if we didn't fit in. Imagine now if your lives depended on one another, if you had that same feeling of isolation, how you would be able to perform in that same situation. So it's really feeling disconnected. And when we have those stressful situations of our operational teams, and you have a member who doesn't feel like they're in the fold and isolated and understands how their other teammates think and react, how that can have a readiness implication. So social isolation is more than just a feeling of being lonely. It's about how you relate to other people. We built Team Core to equip soldiers and leaders with the tools to assist those at risk for social isolation and build new connections and communicate effectively and diffuse those tensions within the units. So the word unit, what I've observed personally is when we close our eyes and imagine the Army unit, we imagine the fire teams or the squads or those individuals who are going forward beyond the wire. I would say these principles that are associated with Team Core goes a little bit beyond that, and it focuses on the Army unit being our family members, our children, our dependents, caring for not just those that are in our units, but our communities. And I really appreciate Dr. ONeill mentioning culture. Culture is incredibly important. If one team is exhibiting this type of culture and climate within them, it can easily be drowned out by the hundreds that aren't. So these type of principles, these caring, kindness, being human, and obviously different phrases, it has an impacting effect on readiness and the individual. And I'm just going to give a brief example. I'm just coming out of command in Hohenfels, Germany. So for those of you who are unaware, the Hohenfels, Germany is one of the smallest installations in Bavaria. It's where the Joint Multinational Training Center is. About maybe 7,000 total Americans in the area. We don't have an American hospital anywhere near us. Landstuhl is about 5 hours away. And when COVID hit in Germany, boy, did we feel isolated. We knew what isolation felt like because we didn't have those inpatient facilities right near us that were American or that friendly voice that was familiar to us. But what the leadership did at in Bavaria Garrison and Medac Bavaria is they understood that tension, that stress. And so every week, even if there wasn't an update, it didn't matter. They talked to the individuals within the communities and they answered their questions. And in my own personal little village, my Bavarian hamlet that I lived in Hohenfels, we locked arms and we said, look, we're gonna speak freely, openly, and honestly to one another. We understand there's things that we don't know and we're gonna accept that, but we're gonna decide as a community, our culture is going to be one of honesty, transparency, and we're gonna help each other out. And that's what we did. And I sincerely believe it is that cultural piece that makes a difference. That's the secret sauce, is not just one team or one leader adopting this mantra or these principles, but it's going to take leaders at every level to appreciate that one soldier isolated can have multiple ramifications. One family isolated that's the pariah of the community can have ramifications to others. So it's important that we bring everyone into the fold, into our total unit, into the Army. So that's my take on it.
Wonderful. For those that are online and this is your first time hearing about our checklist, they can be found at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research website, as well as within this month's Investigators Dispatch. Those will be shared in the administrative notes that are coming out online with this, but we will also share that link for everybody so that you can download them and use them. As we transition this conversation and move on, I think it's important that we think about leaders and teams, and that leaders are really leading from the front on this, and not just telling people what to do, but actually leading from that. I will tell you, the thing I focused on is making sure I still get my sleep and my mindfulness and my exercise, right? And I share that with my team. We've been really working hard to build physical and psychological resilience. This last month, we're doing a happiness challenge. And every day we focus on something people can do that's small and achievable that can actually help them during this time. For communication, we went from where I used to send a message out to the 2,700 people of RARE every 2 weeks to where I'm sending it out twice a week and daily to leaders to make sure they understand what's going on. We've been really trying to do that because I think it's really important that you walk the walk. And, you know, the thing is, you know, we talked a lot about sharing a meal, and we can easily say, well, in COVID, we can't do this, but we can, right? So we had an organization day the other week. We had a Zumba by Microsoft Teams, right? And so people can get online and do Zumba. And then we had a cater lunch where our mission essential people could go pick up a lunch and then go and eat. But at least they knew we cared and we were investing in them. So although they might not have been eating around a big picnic table with 12 people surrounding them, we found a way to make sharing a meal possible in a COVID world that was really safe. So as we transition, what I'd like to do is really kind of have Dr. Adler weigh in the role of leaders in creating kind of that team core concept. And so if you can lead that off, that would be great.
Sure. What I was thinking of as you were talking was that we've talked about the role of COVID and how that's impacted all of us, but the lessons that we've learned in terms of the importance of leadership and the importance of unit cohesion matter both during this really high stress period, this kind of chronic low stress, chronic moderate stress period, and it can be lifted and brought over to any discussion about how units function and how leaders operate under operational conditions, and potentially even in the future in terms of multi-domain operations. So this expectation that small units are going to be expected to function as disaggregated groups operating without necessarily a big footprint, and they're kind of on their own and they have to function under arduous conditions, this same idea, the same principles definitely apply. So one of the things I heard, for example, is that Colonel Preston mentioned is that it's really important to consider when you're thinking about connection and the importance of units connecting with one another, that as individuals start to disconnect, as they start to feel socially isolated or lonely, that this in it of itself is a risk to the group. It's a risk to the team because social isolation is contagious. There's wonderful work by John Cacioppo that and others that's demonstrated this connection between people starting to feel isolated and the fact that that becomes contagious. So leaders need to really keep an eye out for it, and unit members can be part of the solution. It isn't just one way, as Colonel Teyhen mentioned, but it is something to think about. Now, what we've done at RARE is we've developed training based off of work that John Cacioppo, he's passed away now, but that John Cacioppo had developed with a large Army grant, and we've called it Team Core. And Team Core is training that is designed to boost unit cohesion. It's things that units can do to really kind of build their culture in a smarter way, kind of to Dr. ONeill's point, and really things also that leaders can do that make a difference. And early results that we have show that when leaders engage in these behaviors, when they listen, when they encourage cohesion, when they prioritize it, when they integrate new members into their unit thoughtfully and deliberately, when they emphasize the importance of trust, and they really sort of heighten this issue around communication and being someone who is able to proactively communicate and over communicate, that all of these behaviors, when you add them all up, even controlling for generally being a good leader, if a leader engages in these sort of team core or cohesion oriented behaviors, then units do better. In terms of various outcomes. And so it's not necessarily a panacea for all issues, but it gives units that edge. It's the edge that units are going to need in multi-domain operations, or they're going to need during periods of time like what we're going through right now with these chronic periods of stress where it's really hard to see how long it's going to be until there's a shift in what's expected of units. So this idea of nurturing the culture to be the culture that you want as a leader kind of gives you an avenue for how you can have a direct impact that's over and above just being kind of a good leader in general.
Thank you, Dr. Adler. We're going to go back to Colonel Preston. Colonel Preston, as you've worked with units and you've seen these team core concepts either purposely or accidentally applied to units, how do you think that's impacted unit cohesion, and what have you seen from your lens on the impact of unit cohesion on readiness and performance?
That's a great question, and focusing now more on the operational readiness piece. There's been a lot of great work done, and Dr. Adler and RARE is very familiar with this work, and actually, I think there's some folks on the call involved in this work. When you look at behavioral health minded leadership in combat, and when you have, there's a fairly large study done, I want to say it was like 2011, please correct me if I have the years incorrect, but the essence of the article was that if you looked at individuals who are exposed to tremendous amount of trauma in combat, and those that weren't, but they were deployed, and then you separated those groups into those with behavioral health minded supported leaders, specifically NCOs, and those that were deemed as not supportive, more directive, angry. Those that had the good leaders, quote unquote, good leaders, the supportive behavioral health minded leaders, had fewer screened positive, less for behavioral health diagnoses. In fact, even controlling for the amount of combat or the combat dosage, somebody with a good leader that had direct no kidding combat had relatively fewer behavioral health casualties than somebody that really didn't have that much combat but had a very poor leader. And so this speaks to the essence of what it is to be a leader. And this is not new. This is not a new principle. This goes back eons. But it's something that we continually need to fine tune as we move ahead, because generations change, modalities of how we communicate change. Look at us right now on Teams. I know folks are talking about, how do I break bread with my folks? That's why Army leaders are creative and adaptive. Right? We need to be creative and adaptive, and figure out how to get into that white space and not just be there at work to give direction, but ensure that our folks know how to call us when they need us, and know that when they need us, we're not going to judge them. And so if we have those just basic principles that Dr. Adler was talking about with Team Core, tried and true. It's tried and true. And I think those that are on the call, you can probably close your eyes and think back to a leader that really inspired you. And whenever, as a mentor to the 60 Whiskeys, the Army psychiatrists, they talk about mentorship. And I like to say, if you want to be a good mentor, close your eyes and think about those mentors in your life, or those leaders in your life that you really have a lot of respect for. Be like them. Be like them. And Team Core is a platform for you to do that. It is one tool in your leader's toolkit to do it. It may work better if you use parts of it or all parts of it. But the important thing is to have those connections with your folks.
All right, Dr. ONeill, before we go to the question and answer session, what I really would like you to answer is, from your perspective, working with firefighters and sports teams and non-military teams, what have you learned about unit cohesion that might actually be helpful for us here in the military?
Well, in some ways, we're all people, right? So that definitely matters. I mean, one of the things that's a little bit different is, how do we change culture? And I would say that in some cases in civilian life, it's easier to change culture rapidly and faster because people are embedded in smaller units and smaller organizations. So one of the things to think about is, that's amazing. And I would say the Army's on the forefront of developing techniques that can be widespread across what I think is the largest organization in the world, but that size matters. And so one of the things to take into account is, that I think is the same actually, is a lot of civilian organizations have this metaphor of family, and I think the military does too. And by family, we don't necessarily refer to, our non-work life. I love the nod to our non-work life. Actually, someone asked about, Zoom and how can we break bread? One of the things that's so amazing is I think it's helping to break down barriers in terms of the separation between work and family, because many of us have been, that BBC dad where the kid, walked in when you're in a meeting, and, it's just, it's a way to get to know people. I mean, there's an intimacy that comes from Zoom that's kind of paradoxical. You think you're so distant, but actually, you get to know where people live, you get to know their families, you get to know their pets, which is kind of nice. And I think that, in some ways, civilian organizations have been onto this for some time, this work from home business. And now we're all sort of catching on to realize that actually there might be something to it. With that said, though, there are some, tips to make it a little more useful. So, having a Zoom call of, 40 people is maybe not the best way to make use of, breaking bread with 40 people is a little bit different than breaking bread with like 3 or 4 people. So I think, we realize, in civilian life, the importance of team size. There are variations in this, like team size matters on these calls too. I would say turn the video on. I mean, we've gotten a lot of sense about the importance of emotions. And along with that family member comes, you've got angry Uncle Ed, and so sometimes that's another of those things we can't necessarily control. But, I would say peel back the layers in terms of, one of the things with civilian life is that, you can fire people. You can fire angry Ed a little easier. But I think in military life, you can't necessarily fire angry Ed. You need to deal with angry Uncle Ed. And I think that learning those skills of emotion regulation is one of the most useful things to apply, particularly to military life, because he's a part of the family too. And I think one strategy is to isolate him and kind of put him in his corner, but that's not going to help anybody, especially angry Ed. And I think that getting to the root of people's pain is a lot of it. Usually if you peel back the layers of anger, there's someone who was deeply hurt or deeply pained, someone who's longing for connection. The most the bitter people are usually the people who are optimistic and, something happened to them. So I think really, again, like peeling back the layers of people is one way to mitigate against this tendency towards isolation. Because actually this is a part of the family. And, in terms of how to cope, another, emotion skill, my work in civilians has shown that, it's the combination of positive emotions that really matters. We spend a lot of time talking about negative emotions. It's easier. It rolls off the tongue. We spend a lot less time on the positive emotions. We don't even really have a vocabulary. And so my work has shown that, depending on what you're trying to get at, positive emotions can help you with performance, and they can help you with health and well-being. So they're not all the same. It's not just this one big sort of positive emotion soup. So with firefighters, for example, which I think is the closest comparison, we found that what really moved the needle in performance is joviality, sort of like kind of practicing in, how we're going to operate in times of stress, knowing each other's weaknesses. But then the thing that mattered in terms of mental health and behavioral health was really like this caring and compassion. And the combination of the two was what you really want to go. Because we all know that the joking taken too far can be really problematic. And I think that's one thing to realize, that, any of these can get out of hand, any of these emotions, but, having the caring helps you know when you need to rein it in. Because honestly, some people's pain is something that really shouldn't be messed around with. It's not funny. And I think recognizing those boundaries is helpful.
Wonderful. So the first question, we're going to transfer on to question and answer session with the last 10 minutes we have. So the first one, I'm going to summarize a bit, but all these tools, whether it be mindfulness or resilience tools or self-calming tools, when you teach them to elite athletes, there's a coach to teacher ratio or coach to athlete ratio that is pretty small. How do you scale some of these concepts across the military when you think about the size, right? How do we do the scalability? Earlier this week, I had the pleasure of interviewing Lieutenant General Pyatt on mindfulness, and he really has this concept of just making sure that you get the leader buy-in, and as the leaders buy in, they will continue to push it out and really do it more from the coalition of the willing, right? And as people see the benefits, the coalition of the willing increases. And so Dr. Adler, I see your hand up. I'll go to you next.
Thanks. I just wanted to jump right in because we just published a study recently, just in the past month, that highlights the importance of scalability. So we were focused on one particular domain of leadership, which was on sleep. And we had done a randomized trial where some platoon leadership teams got sleep leadership training. So 1 hour of, the importance of sleep and how that would look in a unit, and as a leader, what your responsibilities are. And we broke it down to very specific behaviors. And the other group of platoon leadership team members didn't get that training. And we followed up their units about 2 months later. And the unit that got the leader that was trained actually slept more 8 weeks later than the unit that was in the control condition. Now, the unit members, they didn't know that their leaders had been trained. They were just filling out some survey. What did they know? But the fact that we were able to show that if you train the leaders, this in specific behaviors, it wasn't just notional, but some specific leader behaviors, that actually had an impact really 6 to 8 weeks later on unit members. And that actually, I was hoping we'd see that, but we actually saw it. And I was really heartened, because that's the concept that General Pyatt's talking about, that you get the leaders prepared and the leaders can have this impact. And through that, there's scalability.
All right, I'm going to go next to the second question, because we'll try to get through as many questions as possible. And this one follows on really nicely with what Dr. Adler just replied with. And this says, and I'm going to paraphrase, is that, at the battalion level and really at the senior levels, people and leaders acknowledge what we're saying is important. But this usually is a breakdown happens at the company, platoon, squad level, right? As you get smaller, that first line supervisor is so critical. So the more people it says, the more people I ask, the more I find that the most important leader is the team leader, that local team leader or that first line supervisor. If we look at corporations and the changes that CEOs try to make in the culture, not only take time, but also at the lowest level, changes are often felt to only be minimal, like a 10% difference in the work environment. Any thoughts on trickle-down cultural change? We'll start with Sam, Colonel Preston, and then we'll go to Dr. ONeill.
Thanks, Colonel Teyhen. And whoever asked this question, that is a phenomenal question, and you are calibrated to what is going on and what's being observed at the senior Army level. So shortly after this, I'm going to be participating in the Vice Chief of Staff's meeting with all of the senior leaders, division and above, A Life Worth Living. And in that, just briefly, there are priorities, and one of the priorities, the first priority of that working group is junior leader development. And Forces Command is taking the lead, so General Garrett and his team, and exactly what you're saying is the more mature leaders through experience have developed and maturity, just their own personal maturity, emotional maturity, and maybe they have children of their own, so they're able to nurture these connections just through that. They're able to understand these concepts. And what we've done as an organization is we've made PowerPoints to teach connection. When if you think about PowerPoints and all, we talk about, sexual harassment and assault, suicide prevention, all of these things, there's nothing more sterile than sitting in a room and looking at a PowerPoint. We've got to flip the script. We have got to flip the script as an organization, and Forces Command is looking at the team level, so even below the squad, but even the fire team level, and saying, how do we get the information across? We enable our junior leaders to get the so what and the importance, but we don't do it in a way that it's in a classroom. And right now they're trying to integrate physical activity, things that people can enjoy, team building, so that they can see, hey, if you have a close team and you understand the strengths and weaknesses of your team and you work together to get the highest average, you do better. And so it is a cultural, going back to the word culture, it is a cultural shift that is acknowledged at the highest levels. And that speaks to, okay, highest levels get it. How do we get it down to that lowest level? Well, that is the trick. That is the trick. And Forces Command is taking the lead on that. And then TRADOC is also in these discussions to develop training that helps build those teams. And it'll be informed by the people on this panel. So that was an excellent question.
Before we go to the last question, Dr. ONeill, do you have anything to add on how to answer the small teams, not just getting it up at the corporate level, but to get the more first-line supervisors engaged?
Absolutely. That is where the training really needs to take place. I think that at the highest levels, senior command, senior leadership provide the resources to make it happen. And I do find that if the support and the resources are not there at the top level, it's very unlikely that initiatives will work and definitely be scalable. So absolutely, the training, it really points to the importance of training at that level of the direct supervisor. And I think the other panelists absolutely hit on that. That's something that applies to the corporate level, but the resources have to be there, or else, a lot of the initiatives won't be able to succeed. They'll be starved.
Well, I can't believe how insightful the people asking questions are, because it's like we're peeling an onion. So the next question that really has been asked, that really is great follow-on, is will these work well with people that have already had the life experiences to understand the importance of what we're talking about? But a lot of our 18-year-olds might find a lot of these conversations too touchy-feely, or they might lack the maturity, as the question asked, to appreciate how important these goals are, or they might have just a different azimuth of what they decide as a priority. How do we really reach down to those folks that are the youngest of our team members who might not yet see the value of what we're discussing? And I see Colonel Preston putting his hands up, but we'll have all three of our panelists have a chance to do this, as this will be the final question.
All right, so I would say in response to that, it is just like, I don't know if the individual asking the question has children or not, or has been around kids, but you have to meet them where they are. You have to meet them where they are. And so it is it is a fool's errand for us to think that these very complex, emotionally mature theories are going to be grasped by the 18-year-old who just met this girl last week and it's all he can think about, and that's not what's important, right? But what we can do is we can demonstrate teamwork, and we can give them opportunities to work together as a team, and then they'll start putting it together that, oh, when I know how Sarah and Sam are doing next to me, it helps my performance because I know more about them. And we need to give them more opportunities at their level that let them realize that, not PowerPoint slides. And so the question is, how do we get there? And that is the key question. How do we get there?
That is so insightful. I think it really is the duty of the leader and us as research to figure out how to translate this to that audience. It's not the goal of them to figure out what we know academically. It's how we can actually translate that. And so, Dr. ONeill, any thoughts on what you would like to add from what you've seen work?
Absolutely. Importance to speak their language, learn, understand, and speak their language. These are concepts that are very generalizable, but it's important for the leader to do the translation. Don't give them the journal articles, don't give them the PowerPoints, give them, we had a sports metaphor, put them out on the court, talk about it using sports metaphors, whatever's a way to connect using their language. And I love that phrase, meet them where they're at.
And Dr. Adler, any closing comments before I close out the session?
I would just say that from my additional point would be that if they see the relevance and if they can experience the relevance, then that will be of whatever the concept is that's being taught, and the relevance to their own life and how they're going to be better because of it and how it'll help them in some specific way, some concrete way, that's a way to get them motivated and also to gain trust, and using leadership at all levels. Yes, the emphasis is on the small team leaders, but it's really that embedded in this larger nested structure. So it needs to occur at all levels. Thanks.
It's important to start with why, right? We have to start with why. So as we're nearing 1300, I'd like to have an opportunity to thank our panelists today for their time and their perspectives. This is a great discussion, and I'm grateful for each of your contribution, not only to research, but translating research into action and really helping our soldiers, that top 1% of Americans that both qualify and volunteer to serve our nation, and keeping them ready and resilient. Our panel discussion would not have been complete without everyone who joined us today during this hour. We have resources and checklists that we discussed today will be made available to you, and we look forward to sharing this recording on other social media platforms so you can share it with those that might not have been able to join us in real time. We look forward to staying connected with you again, and we just hope everyone that you stay healthy, that you and those you love, that you invest in them as much as you invest in your mission and what you do for a living, and that you have found some balance, even if it's in a new normal. Thank you all so much. Stay safe and stay healthy. Have a great day. Thank you.